Okay, here we go. Everything is set, and we are going to discuss horror storytelling. Now, for tonight, for this broadcast, we will discuss horror, but I won't be getting into horror such that we would need to have the mature tag on. So yes, creepy stuff might come up in the course, but we should be pretty well in the PG-13 range of the discussion, especially because anything we do talk about will have context to it, because of the nature of what we're exploring. Now, even if you're not a fan of horror, that is fine. Like, I don't rush out to see every horror movie that comes out, because horror can be a niche thing for people, because they don't want to be scared, or or because they've seen so much that they actually treat horror more like a comedy with how it's presented, because of just the fact they've been exposed to so much horror media, or in all honesty, they might have been through some pretty horrific things themselves. And when you talk about when you talk about a goblin emerging from the dark with a gleaming grin and a vicious knife. Yeah, so AVP was PG-13. Yeah, we do. I want to make sure we get to the core of it, but I don't need to describe in visceral detail certain things. But, you describe that to, let's say you might have a friend or family member who is a veteran, who actually saw, who was there, on the front line, in the trenches, has gone through some things. Maybe they actually had to bring a squad mate, back to camp from an attack, only to have the medic say, "I'm sorry, I can't sew hamburger back into a cow." So there are people who, or you talk to an EMT even, kind of in a similar vein. Talk to an EMT or someone in the medical profession. Talk to someone who might work in the emergency room. You might have someone in your life that is an undertaker, a mortician, a funerary director, or you might even talk to someone. who has a very strong sense of faith. And so it's not even something out of negative consequences, but you talk to someone who actually has the firm conviction of, I cannot be scared because I have comfort in my heart, in my soul, in my being from my beliefs. A sense of self, a religion. It could be just the faith that another person has put in them to do something. Often that can act as an insulator against horror. Fortunately, there are different ways that you can approach horror, all right? And especially if you take the opportunity to read about the characters you're running your game for, that will give you the cracks that you can slither into, the things that you can explore, and the things that you can exemplify. And I want to talk about that sort of stuff. Now, we will be referencing the Dungeon Master's Guide and the Curse of Strahd, primarily for source material. If you have those books, here they are. I'm going to present some information to you. I would like you to encourage you. If you don't have them, get them. There's great info in here. There's a great game. But this is these are resources that I want you to enjoy and use. Demon or Quingar says, first and foremost, when using horror elements, is consent having a discussion about horror lines? Yeah, I'm going to presume that if you're running horror, that the people at the table know you're running horror. Because if you start running, and this is anyone really, if you get a bunch of people who have signed up, because you want to run the My Little Pony Friendship is Magic role-playing game, and then you turn it into Alien RPG, not everyone, not everyone may appreciate that, and not even from the fact that you duped them and you went from, a story about, ponies and Equestria and magic and flying and everything, like they're actually scared of it or something. There's just people who also would say, you're wasting my time because I don't find this horrific. I wanted to play ponies, and it's not even that aliens scare me. It's the fact that you're wasting my time. And that applies to anything. That applies to My Little Pony Friendship is Magic. So, now there is an element though, Quingar, to have that broad discussion so everyone knows that, horror is on the table or is there. There are going to be... You're going to have to navigate that conversation because you can just end up giving away the story if you go through every little detail. Because, well, part of horror is the unknown. Well, we'll get to that. But broadly, yes, Quingar, you are correct. Make sure that the people you're running any of your games for, Call of Cthulhu, Delta Green, All Flesh Must Be Eaten, Kobolds Ate My Baby, Lasers and Feelings, Honey Heist. Make sure that people have a general understanding of what they're going to get into. You can say, I'm going to run Curse of Strahd. It is a horror-based story. And you can open up a conversation about that. And people might go, horror, fine, whatever, I don't care. Take us on the journey. I don't want to know, because I would rather be among the unknown. So, what can inspire these feelings? What can inspire you to want to visit horror? And Yummy Papa John's Pizza. I love. They were the first company, at least that I knew of, that started including the little spicy peppers, and they also included the garlic butter to dip your crust. I'm like, oh, this is amazing. It's wonderful. Yeah. So, Rad, I will not be giving away anything. I'm just gonna read over. I'm just gonna read over the Revisited and go over the elements of horror as they summarize it here. This will not get into specifics for the story. So even though you want to run it, I should not really be spoiling anything for you. This is about the concept of the story of Curse of Strahd. The concept of horror as Curse of Strahd pulls it together. And then we're going to go from Curse of Strahd and explore horror in other ways. But I do want to, because how do I say this? I to you, so we together, use Dungeons & Dragons primarily as our touchstone, as our base of operations for discussing role-playing games and storytelling in general. Much of what we explore in the workshop has thematic elements that are universal, hence thematic, to every role-playing game as a storytelling game. But we do use Dungeons & Dragons for the most part, as we are very familiar with it. Or even if not, maybe there's someone new out there who's lurking. You've never played a game of D&D before, but that is your entry because you've heard it, it's popular, you've seen Critical Role, maybe you have a cousin that plays, or friends at high school or college or whatever that play. You have other family members, like your parents or something played, and you heard about it. That's what brought you here. So we're going to start with D&D, and then we're going to use that as the launch pad. No, I'm not going to be going into the specific elements, Rad. I want that for all of you to explore. I'm only talking about horror, not the examples of horror that you're going to find in the story. So, we take a minute to read about the experience of the author, the original author and creator of Strahd, because Strahd has been in all editions. This is a long-running campaign setting and villain and a place to visit. You know. We turned the corner, and there was a vampire. I groaned and rolled my eyes. It was 1978, and I was playing in one of my first dungeon adventures. It was being run by a friend I had known in high school, John Scott Clegg, and it was typical of the type of adventure that people played in those days. It was all about exploring a hodgepodge collection of rooms connected by dungeon corridors, beating up the monsters that we encountered, searching for treasure, and gaining experience points. Now we were faced with random encounter number 34, a vampire. Not vampire with a capital V, but a so many hit dice with such and such an armor class lowercase vampire. Just another monster in the dungeon. I remember thinking at the time, what are you doing here? This creature seemed completely out of place with the kobolds, orcs, and gelatinous cubes we had seen thus far. This was a creature who deserved his own setting, and to be so much more than just a wandering monster. When I came home from that game, I told all these thoughts to Laura. That was when Strahd von Zarovich was born. Strahd would be no afterthought. He demanded his own setting, his own tragic history. Laura and I launched into researching the mythology and folklore surrounding the vampire. We started with the vague black and white image of Bela Lugosi in 1931, but found so much more. The first quote-unquote modern literary foundation of the vampire was penned by John William Polidori, based on a fragment of a story by Lord Byron. It was while at the Villa Diodati, a rented house next to Lake Geneva, Switzerland, that Byron and Polidori met Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, and her husband-to-be, Percy Shelley. One night in June, Byron suggested that they each write a ghost story. Mary Shelley's contribution to the effort would later become Frankenstein. The short story, The Vampire, published in 1819, was Polidori's contribution. He was Byron's personal physician and the first of the so-called romantic vampires under Polidori's hand. Was actually modeled after Lord Byron. Byron, like the fictional vampires that he inspired, from Polidori's Lord Ruthven down through the penultimate work of Bram Stoker, was a decadent predator, an abuser hidden behind a romantic veil. He was a comely and alluring monster, but a monster nevertheless. The romantic vampire of the earliest years of the genre was not just a spouse abuser, but a spouse killer, the archetype of abuse and the worst kind of destructive codependency. For Laura and me, those were the elements that truly defined Strahd von Zarovich, a selfish beast forever lurking behind the mask of tragic romance, the illusion of redemption that was ever only camouflage for his prey. Initially, we were going to title the adventure Vampire, one of a series of games we called Night Venture, that Laura and I were self-publishing back in 1978. The castle was called Ravenloft, and when Halloween came around each year, our friends asked us if we could play that Ravenloft game again, and so the better title won out. It was in part because of this design that I was hired by TSR Inc. to write Dungeons and Dragons Adventures in 1982. Soon thereafter, I6 Ravenloft was published. Since then, fans of Ravenloft have seen many different creative perspectives on Barovia, a country which, by absolute coincidence, is featured in a 1947 Bob Hope movie called Where There's Life. It continues to be one of the most popular Dungeons & Dragons adventures of all time. In its various incarnations, each designer has endeavored to bring something new to the ancient legend of Strahd, and to each of them we are grateful. But the vampire genre has taken a turn from its roots in recent years. The vampire we so often see today exemplifies the polar opposite of the original archetype. or archetype if you prefer. The lie that it's okay to enter into a romance with an abusive monster because if you love it enough, it will change. When Laura and I got a call from Christopher Perkins about revisiting Ravenloft, we hoped we could bring the message of the vampire folktale back to its original cautionary roots. The talented team at Wizards of the Coast not only graciously took our suggestions, but engaged us in dialogue that delivered new insights on the nightmare beyond the gates of Barovia. Now we invite you again as our guests to pass through the Svalich Woods if you dare. For here the romance is tragically dangerous, and a true monster smiles at your approach. Tracy Hickman back in 2015. Oh, I can say that now, back in 2015? Oh my gosh, y'all. Where's the time gone? And this is just the 5th edition version of Ravenloft. Remember, the story for Ravenloft started back in 78. Anyway. Here is the seed planted of horror. Of the exploration of the unknown. Of the monsters that really we don't have to go too far to seek out. Because real life, nature is scary, as the saying goes. And all around us, now predominantly that has been exemplified through zombies, right? The Walking Dead is more about the living than the zombies. It's, a lot of zombie tales are about the horrors that humans inflict on each other, because the zombies are just zombies, right? There's no real help in them. Like, yeah, they'll eat you, okay. But the horror, the real horror, not the topical, not the surface level, are the other people. Now, marks of horror, as Curse of Strahd is pointing out and preparing you. So, Radtrills, this section, for you as a prospective DM, read through it as well. This isn't going to spoil the story for any of you out there. This is to help get you prepared to experience the story. Marks of horror. Okay, got it. Then, yeah, you already know that Curse of Strahd will have horror elements. If you didn't, I'm sorry, then I guess I spoiled that for you, Radtrills. But I will not be spoiling anything for you as a player. I'm sorry if I misread what you were talking about. Yeah, vampires are horror? So, these are the marks of horror. The unknown. This is the first one for a reason. Horror is born out of the unknown. Actually, here it says, horror is born out of fear of the unknown. Our fear is heightened when the darkness engulfs us and we can't see, or when the truth is behind a locked door, covered by a sheet, or buried in the soft earth. It's not the monster, but its shadow that breeds horror. The more we know about a monster, the less we fear it. So the trick is to keep it out of the light for as long as possible. Here are 2 tricks to heighten the fear of the unknown. When it seems as though the characters have everything under control, you can have a gust of wind suddenly blow out their torches, plunging them into darkness. Before a monster appears, take a moment to describe the odor that precedes it, the eerie sound it makes, or the weird shadow it casts. It is all about that unknown, and this occurs in movies as well, and in novels. As soon as you see the monster, there's a good chance you're going to see the monster's zipper for their costume, and you're going to go, alright, well, that, it was what it was, but, it's, I'm not scared anymore. And so, that is where our fears come from. Because you will find there's not going to be a lot of ontology. Yeah, because there's ontology. One is words, one is bugs. You're not going to find a bunch of people who study bugs. An ontologist. Correct me if I'm wrong. My brain is caught up now, because I recently went over the pun of the bugs and words. Entomology. Yeah, thank you. Oh, Belle the cat. Good to see you again. Because there's entomology and entomology. Yeah. So it's the words in the. I had that in my brain, and I was crossing a wire. Anyway. So you're going to find a lot of people who study bugs are not afraid of them because they understand how bugs work. People who own tarantulas know about tarantulas, and they're not really scared about getting bit because they have very mild tarantulas, or they know how to handle them in such a way that it won't provoke being bitten. They understand the behavior. They understand that a pet tarantula won't just bite you. Because, especially if you just fed it, etc. Right? If you know how sharks work, Jaws may not be as scary to you. Either the broader fear of the sea, thalassophobia, or just of sharks in particular. If you are an ichthyologist, there we go, then... I mean, sharks are still a concern, but you're not necessarily scared of them. You might even be the guy or the girl who dives into the tank at the aquarium and scrubs the display for everyone to see the great whites going in this, going around the same tank that you're scrubbing. I used to have a pet tarantula. It took a year before I picked it up, but after that it was easy, says Belle. Well, thank you for sharing your experience then. Rip Artist, you want a pet tarantula. So, the unknown. This is always the biggest point of any horror storytelling. You keep things in the dark, you keep things in the shadows. You make illusions. ALLUSIONS. Illusions. I mean, illusions can play into it, but you make allusions to things. You talk about smells that might be in juxtaposition to where you're at. Foreshadowing. Foreshadowing is about finding clues to a horrible truth yet to be revealed. Consider the following examples. Before characters encounter a monster, hint at the monster's presence with clues such as claw marks, gnawed bones, and bloodstains. Whenever characters take a long rest, give one character a prophetic dream in which he or she glimpses something yet to be found or encountered. Oh, I like that three-parter, Rip Artist. You see this a lot. Now, in literature, it could be more subtle with foreshadowing. In a lot of horror video games, you see this, and it's a lot of times more overt, because like in Resident Evil, they'll make clues sparkle, or there will be like a little notification of, hey, there's a note, and if you read the note, it's from the person who survived the boss that you're going to go into, saying, I don't know, like, it hurts, watch out for the mouth, and then like that's a weak point or the danger point. Right? There's notes or clues. The foreshadowing, if there's claw marks in the trees, that, what does that mean? That means that there are dire koalas that are climbing around, and you don't know where they're at. Because at any point in time, they can fall upon you. That would be foreshadowing. Yeah, video games can force it as well, Capo. That's true. With how they work. Though you don't have... Well, a DM could impose those restrictions. I will say in most games, you don't have those restrictions, meaning you can pass that note very easily and not be prepared for what lies ahead, but the DM put the note there. Or the DM put the claw marks on the trees. Or the DM keeps telling you, like, why in this game does the DM keep saying something about the moon cycle? And in no other game have I ever worried about the moon, waxing at half. Now, here's the best part. As the DM, as the storyteller, if you include that, that can raise suspense without it necessarily meaning anything. Because sometimes the little bit of details in there, if you break things down into detail, that can increase the suspense. Anyway, age. Everything, in this case, the environment is old and time-worn. Everywhere they go, they should be reminded of death, decay, their own mortality. You get that a lot in Warhammer 40,000. It is the symbols around you. It puts you into the time, right? It takes you back to a place that seems out of place and or out of time. Maybe back to simpler times, but simpler times weren't always better times, because if you stole a loaf of bread, the simpler times meant that you got your hand cut off. Oh. In simpler times, you might get hanged for what is now considered a petty crime. Oh. Simpler times may not always be better times. And so the age, the description of the environment, does a lot of storytelling for you. When you describe the rotting timbers of buildings, faded clothing, worm-ridden pages of books, rust on iron fences and gates, there's a story to why it's there. Someone had to make it, someone had to install it, and someone for a long time had to neglect it. Why was it neglected, especially if grand places even show signs of neglect? Or for the places that aren't neglected, that actually raises your suspicion. If you are, playing through something horrific, I don't know, you're going through the mansion in Resident Evil. A lot of the mansion looks pretty, tore up or whatever. The zombies are roaming. You get to a safe room and things actually look organized because zombies haven't been there. It's actually still a taken care of room. Of course, there's environmental things like the light, the music changes and everything. But environmental storytelling does a lot. Are people too busy to paint their fences or to mend them? Or what's happened? Valandor!
10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10
10 10 10. Thank you very much, Valandar. Yep, there's a reason people aren't there anymore. And the reason's not always too pretty, right? Exactly. Bell the Cat. Capo says small red herrings are good too. If you reference the full moon cycle, but the monster isn't a werewolf, they can feel like you pulled the old switcheroo. There's an escape room that had something similar, says Rip. So I still have my desk in the living room set up from when I was working for AT&T. I think tomorrow I'll clear it off and set it up as a painting station. So this is a reclamation of something that wasn't good, or I'm sorry, Valandar, if this is is this sort of a veiled message of something, or is this a very good and positive message? Hi, Thorn Umbreon, good to see you. Light. A tale that is perpetually dark in tone becomes tiresome very quickly. It needs to feature the occasional ray of light for contrast and to create a sense of hope. Monsters and other terrors must be offset with creatures that are kind and lovable, giving the characters even more reasons to stand against the darkness. Here are a couple ways to add glimmers of light to a tragic tale. Describe an occasional scene of beauty, such as a flower growing atop a grave. Make sure the heroes of the story might actually get to know people who are trying to live a good, honest, God-fearing life. That there might actually be that safe room like in Resident Evil. If everything is dark all the time, it will get boring and nothing will be scary. Because then you just expect everything to go bump in the night because it's never not night. And so everything bumps in the night. It can be draining, and not in the vampiric way. And that's also going to go into humor as well. Details. In a horror story, there's no telling where danger might be lurking. A leering gargoyle might be a monster in disguise or merely a fiendish sculpture. A mirror hanging on a wall might have the power to transfix all who gaze into it, or might be nothing out of the ordinary. In a horror story, taking the time to describe an object in detail draws attention to it, makes one suspicious of it, and might distract from the real danger. Here's a couple of tricks you can use. Put the focus on something, and then as a storyteller, you can waylay them with something else, especially if that's a point of light. The flower growing on the grave. Oh, it's beautiful. Thank you. Finally, something that's not terrible all the time. They go over, they might even pluck the flower, smell it. It's beautiful. There's not even a bee in there to sting their nose. And then, then no sooner do they have that, there's attention. They pluck it, they smell it, they keep it. Boom, then you hit them. Humor. There are no stranger bedfellows than horror and humor. Tension can't be sustained indefinitely, so a dash of humor provides a respite, giving horror a chance to sneak up on us later and catch us off guard. By the way, this is also often called gallows humor. While humor situations will occur naturally in the course of running the adventure, here are some tips for creating humor when needed. Allow the NPCs, even the evil ones, to crack jokes, speak in a funny voice. Or you can have a fearsome monster, if they roll a 1 on something, slip, right? You're being pursued by... let's go back to Resident Evil. You're being pursued by hunters. Ferocious beasts. These things are made to kill. One of them runs into the room, slips on a pool of blood, and falls over. It's okay to laugh sometimes. You can have dark humor, gallows humor, or even just irony. Really help tell the tale. Because you need moments to breathe, to know that you're alive, and therefore you still have something to lose. But once you're ground down to the point where you can't even feel that, the horror is over because you've just accepted the end. Right? That in itself is a horrible, terrible way to live. But if you want to tell a story that has people going along for the journey, let them breathe and remind them that they are alive, even if the situation might be dire. Using space that's been sitting there lately. And tonight my players realized they messed up. They responded to a sending about an emergency by the druid pulling up a large kelp map, and the party using transport via plant to get there from the ship at sea. And now that the emergency is over, they have to wait 2 months for the ship to catch up to where they are. So, side adventures, right? Well, what are you going to do about that, Valendar? Thorn, we're talking about horror storytelling tonight. Yep, spooky tips. Afterfoff says, oh, that reminds me. Is there a system online for lunar cycles for RPGs, including how the moon looks at different longitudes? I don't know offhand. If any RPG is going to have a moon cycle, it might be in this upcoming Dragonlance book, because the moons play a big part in that. As well, any of the werewolf RPGs. The werewolf RPGs, I believe, do have some sort of a lunar cycle to them as well. As for how it looks at different... I think it's Solitary, Nuatari, Lunatari, and is it Solitari is the other one? For how the moon looks at different longitudes, there might be places like NASA or some other space agencies might have pictures or advice regarding that, or like a simulator that would put you anywhere on the Earth at any point in time and let you look at the constellations and something like that after FOV. So, some very basic tips. It's okay to provide breathers. Not everything can be dark and edgy all the time. Give points of light, give time to make some jokes, or to come down from the high of being chased and almost losing their lives again, right? Not that I'm aware of after FOV. Something like that might exist as some kind of a supplement, but I couldn't tell you offhand. There could be something, if not in Drive-Thru RPG, in the Dungeon Masters version of it for D&D. There's also a World of Darkness version, the Storyteller's Vault, I believe it's called. The Storyteller's Vault might have supplemental stuff for people who are playing werewolves about the eclipses and lunar phases and how it looks in different places as well. Even in the Dungeon Master's Guide, there are things to prompt you for telling different kinds of stories. There's the classic heroic fantasy, the sword and sorcery, the epic fantasy, the mythic fantasy, but we can get into a couple of the darker types. Dark fantasy. Vampires brood on the battlements of their accursed castles. Necromancers toil in dark dungeons to create horrid servants made of dead flesh. Devils corrupt the innocent, and werewolves prowl the night. All of these elements evoke horrific aspects of the fantasy genre. If you want to put a horror spin on your campaign, by the way, everyone, this is page. Well, when they put a page number in here, page 40 of the DMG. If you're reading along at home, if you want to put a horror spin on your campaign, you have plenty of material to work with. The monster manual is full of creatures that perfectly suit a storyline of supernatural horror. The most important element of such a campaign, though, isn't covered by the rules. A dark fantasy setting requires an atmosphere. You're going to be hearing certain words repeated through all of the different examples I'm going to give you all. A dark fantasy setting requires an atmosphere of building dread, created through careful pacing and evocative description. Your players contribute too. They have to be willing to embrace the mood you're trying to evoke. Whether you want to run a full-fledged dark fantasy campaign or a single creepy adventure, you should discuss your plans with the players ahead of time to make sure they're on board. Horror can be intense and personal, and not everyone is comfortable with such a game. Novels and game products set in Ravenloft, the Demiplane of Dread, explore dark fantasy elements in D&D. Intrigue. Now, this can go into the concept of the thriller, and we'll get into that as well. The corrupt vizier schemes with the Baron's oldest daughter to assassinate the Baron. A hobgoblin army sends doppelganger spies to infiltrate the city before the invasion. At the embassy hall, the spy in the royal court makes contact with his employer. Remember, the unknown being a big part of horror or spooky, like intense storytelling. Political intrigue, espionage, sabotage, and similar cloak and dagger activities can provide the basis for an exciting D&D campaign. In this kind of game, the characters might care more about skill training and making contacts than about attack spells and magic weapons. Role-playing and social interaction take on greater importance than combat, and the party might go for several sessions without seeing a monster. Mystery, the whole 3 legendary magic weapons who stole 3 legendary magic weapons and hid them away in a remote dungeon, leaving a cryptic clue to their location. Who placed the Duke into a magical slumber, and what can be done to awaken him? Who murdered the Guildmaster, and how did the killer get into the Guild's locked vault? A mystery-themed campaign puts characters in the role of investigators, perhaps traveling from town to town to crack tough cases. This mystery could also go into like mystery suspense. You want to talk about like The Thing? The Thing would be mystery based. You know, who is the traitor among them? Amogus. Who is the Amogus? Yep, and we will get into music and lighting and other things. Exactly, Belle. You are correct. Now, there are also some optional rules. This is just talking about D&D, though we can extrapolate. We can extrapolate from that other things that you can do to increase the tension at your table, to get people's hearts beating a little bit more quickly. On page 270, this begins some combat options. I don't know if any of you have ever taken a look at these or considered these for any of the games you've run or played in. There's a lot of really good options in the DMG that you can invoke. Alternative initiative, action options, just a generic disarm and mark, so that you don't just have to be the battle master for it. Overrun, shove aside, cover, injuries. This is something that would get more into the violence or gore category of horror, where you don't just keep it vague. Saying you take 10 points of damage means almost nothing. Maybe in an absolute sense, if you only have 11 hit points, that might cause some concern. Remember what was talked about. Detail. Detail. Lingering injuries or specific injuries ramp up the tension in the heat of combat. Wait, you mean in Dungeons and Dragons, I might actually be able to lose an eye as a rule of the game? Why, yes, you can. Now, this is an optional, this is something optional, where, yeah, you take 10 points of damage, but do you know where those 10 points of damage came from? Lose an arm or hand, limp, an internal injury. Massive damage. A rule for just massive damage. You can have, you can have 300 hit points, but what massive damage would do, would if you take X amount of damage all at once, that can actually fell you. You know? I would wager, in a wartime setting, a general and a private can probably only take so much battle damage before both of them would fall down. Okay? And so if you've ever been like, yeah, why is that? Like, you'd think that a general in an army, would only, realistically, I know we're talking about fantasy and realism, only, be able to get, a musket to the innards once, just like a private, a fresh recruit, half his age. Massive damage is a way to escalate the risk. because now both of them could possibly be knocked out by that same massive damage. Morale is a rule that you can invoke as well. There are also rules on insanity. We will get to this. We can touch on this a little bit here tonight as well. If you treat insanity like a stat or like a pool of hit points, you have missed the point. Just like giving Cthulhu hit points, that completely undermines what Cthulhu actually is. As soon as you give Cthulhu hit points, that's it, right? You've reduced it to just a pool of hit points. Kind of like what was talked about here in Curse of Strahd, when the creators of Barovia and Strahd were like, this is just a vampire, but it's not even a vampire. It's just a pool of hit points with a face. A generic face. So if you go through and treat insanity like it's like, oh, I'm crazy, blah, that's not doing the mechanic or the concept justice. And howdy to you, Orchid Twilight. So I would urge you, please go through the Dungeon Master's Guide and look at these other rules. There are ways that you can play there's rest variants. You want to make people a lot more cautious? Invoke things like gritty realism. The variant uses a short rest of 8 hours and a long rest of 7 days. You want to talk about ramping up the tension at your table? Go for gritty realism. This puts brakes on the campaign, requiring the players to carefully judge the benefits and drawbacks of combat. Characters can't afford to engage in too many battles in a row, and all adventuring requires careful planning. If you want epic heroism, that's on the other end. A short rest is 5 minutes and a long rest is an hour. You're recharged and you're ready to go. I have unlimited power. As you're slogging through. That becomes like a Dynasty Warriors kind of a thing, right? Slow natural healing. Healer's kit dependency. When your life is on a much limited resource than a bunch of cure spells that can just be always cast. That ramps up the tension. And why do you need tension? Because if you know that Michael Myers chasing you with a knife will only deal 1d4 plus 5 points of damage, and then you go, oh, I have 100 hit points. Michael Myers can only deal 1d, like maybe he has a multi-attack. Ooh, why am I scared of his big butcher knife that deals 1d4 plus 5 damage? Oh, maybe he'll multi-attack me 3 times with the butcher knife. So what? I'll face tank him. I'll just go like right up to him and take on Michael Myers, because now the horror has turned into hit points, has turned into math, has just turned into a nebulous concept. Horror is more of a personal, visceral thing. Horror is personal and visceral. Yeah, well, there was something like that for disease and other things in the Lingering Injuries Goblin of Gygaxanor. Yeah, math, because horror is not supposed to make sense, and math is supposed to make sense all the time. There are avatars like that Cthulhu has. In fact, there's one that you can paint yourself called the Star Spawn of Cthulhu, Orchid. It's a really cool mini. It's one of the Pathfinder unpainted minis. The Star Spawn of Cthulhu. So these are other ways. Hi, Raichi. We will, by the way, we might see. Here, come up and say hi to everyone. You will not be seeing Nisa. She's not been feeling good lately. She's been kind of reclusive and not eating and drinking a lot. So you will not be seeing her on the desk because she's I think she's just gone back to her little crate and is sleeping. So I don't know. I'll talk to the vet tomorrow and see if they need a follow-up with her. And Mushhead, hello and welcome to you. Thank you for the follow. That's why I like Monster of the Week with the health kind of thing. You suffer harm, sure, but you don't know how much harm you're about to be dealt. And you don't know if your harm is actually going to do jack against your monster unless you did research. These rules for fear and horror can help you sustain an atmosphere of dread in a dark fantasy campaign. When adventurers confront threats they have no hope of overcoming, you can call for them to make a wisdom saving throw. Set the DC according to the circumstances. A character who fails the save becomes frightened for 1 minute. The character can repeat the saving throw at the end of each of his or her turns, ending the effect on the character on a successful save. Horror. Horror involves more than simple fright. It entails revulsion and anguish. Often it arises when adventurers see something completely contrary to the common understanding of what can and should occur in the world, or upon the realization of a dreadful truth. In such a situation, you can call on characters to make a charisma saving throw to resist the horror. Set the DC based on the magnitude of the horrific circumstances. On a failed save, a character gains a short-term or long-term form of madness that you choose or determine randomly. When we get into Alien RPG, I want to show you how that system simulates horror as well. Now, these are mechanics put to emotion, so they're kind of at ends. But these are still things that you can consider for the application to the players in your game or to those who are, if you're writing a story and you're telling a story. Now, a story's a lot easier to control because you're the only one controlling everything. In a game, you might want to use a system like this about bestowing madnesses. Hey, DMP, it's been a while. Good to see you, my friend. So there are mechanics that you can invoke, though I would say that these can be fun and help to support the horror. These mechanics themselves are not horror nor fear. These are ways you can escalate the emotion at the table, because ultimately, you're trying to make the player feel the horror, not just the character. Right? You want the player to catch on and to feel the horror to express through their character. And to think about how would my character react in such a horrific situation. And on that note, let's take a look over here, because we're going to be keeping a note sheet. Horror. The feeling of revulsion that usually follows a frightening sight, sound, or otherwise experience. This is a you need to change your pants moment. Horror, it more or less features the return of the monsters. If you're doing, several encounters, or you're doing more than a one-shot, horror would focus on the returning monsters. That would be something like Hellraiser, right, with Pinhead and the Cenobites. Horror is what you feel after something frightening. Because it's the adrenaline, the guilt, the shame, the whatever the emotion is you experience after the thing that just happened. Not only was what you saw, disgusting to you, but you might need to change your pants because you peed them a little bit. When we talk about horror, horror is the focus of what happens after the gnarly stuff. Terror is the feeling of dread and anticipation that precedes. It is the buildup. So horror and terror are interlinked, but they are two different things. Terror is the buildup, and the buildup, and the buildup, and the buildup. Whereas a thriller, which can feature moments where you tense up or you're scared, and thrillers have horrific moments in them, but they may not necessarily. But thriller would not necessarily be terror. It can, but anyway, thriller, an exciting, suspenseful player story, especially a mystery story. It is the what happens next, or instead of instead of being on the the edge of your seat, or here you're in the edge of your seat, whereas horror is you got to change your pants. This is what keeps you, you paid for the whole seat, but you're only going to use the edge. The thrillers are the returns of the protagonists. And an example of this could be, Aliens. Ripley, as the protagonist, continually returns. And we are finding out, we're asking ourselves, what's happening next? What's happening next? That's gross. Ew. I might have peed myself a little, but what's happening next? Where is this going? It is that motion. It's not a build up to a crescendo, and that's it. It is the going and going and going and going. That is the thriller. And the thriller has moments of horror. Look at the Alien franchise. Now, there is also terror. Overall, I would say it's a thriller. You could even say that James Bond is a thriller. Is there a lot of horror in James Bond? I mean, there's like shootouts and people die. So there's some violence or gore. A gadget might do something, or I don't know. There's the scene in one of the movies where someone does something and gets frozen. That is a moment that could be horrific of horror, but overall, James Bond would be a thriller that can have slight horror elements. There's James Bond discovers the Golden Girl, and I'm not talking about the sitcom. But that would then be the thriller, because we hear a lot of things like suspense, thrills, chills, and spills, horror, terror, monster. Clever? If you want to tell a story that involves these elements, know the pacing and know the terminology. And before we end this part of the workshop, to help back this up, I want to bring this over to you all. Let's take a look at a couple quotes from Alfred Hitchcock himself. Probably someone who knows a couple things about horror, okay? There is no terror in the bang, only the anticipation of it. Now, the bang it could be the horror, because something will probably happen once the bang goes off, and then you get to see the gritty details. If you want words of wisdom from someone who might have a little bit of experience, in horror, there is no terror in the bang, only in the anticipation of it. It's the build-up and the build-up and the build-up before finally the release. The bad thing happens. And remember what was talked about in the Curse of Strahd book. Let's look at a master of horror himself. Puns are the highest form of literature. It's okay to sprinkle in a little bit of levity among the horror. Fear isn't so difficult to understand. After all, weren't we all frightened as children? Nothing has changed since Little Red Riding Hood faced the big bad wolf. What frightens us today is exactly the same sort of thing that frightened us yesterday. It's just a different wolf. This fright complex is rooted in every individual. And this is also why, each of us have our different experiences and knowledges, but there's still an intrinsic hardwired fear effect that is built into us. Whether it's something low-key like an uncanny valley, or it is just that immediate adrenal gland squeezes so hard, you could probably hear it go squick in your body before you are juiced and you are out of there in fight or flight. Good example, Sam Raimi, good horror director and good comedy director. There's a distinct difference between suspense and surprise, and yet many pitchers continually confuse the two. I'll explain what I mean. We are now having a very innocent little chat. Let's suppose that there is a bomb underneath this table between us. Nothing happens, and then all of a sudden, boom, there's an explosion. The public is surprised, but prior to this surprise, it has seen an absolutely ordinary scene of no special consequence. Now let us take a suspense situation. The bomb is underneath the table, and the public knows it, probably because they have seen the anarchist place it there. The public is aware the bomb is going to explode at 1 o'clock, and there is a clock in the decor, in the scene, right? The public can see that it is 1:45. In these conditions, the same innocuous conversation becomes fascinating because the public is participating in the scene. The audience is longing to warn the characters on the screen. You shouldn't be talking about such trivial matters. There's a bomb beneath you that it's about to explode. In the first case, we have given the public 15 seconds of surprise at the moment of the explosion. In the second, we have provided them with 15 minutes of suspense. The conclusion is that whenever possible, the public must be informed, except when the surprise is a twist. That is, when the unexpected ending is, in itself, the highlight of the story. Goblin Psycho starts as a robbery mystery and gets weird. This is another amazing quote, and when you're telling a story, you have to realize that, there are surprises for sure, but there's a lot of suspense because you're telling a story to your players through their characters, and there's moments where they have to separate the two. And your players know what's coming, but their characters don't, and yet you can still whammy them with a surprise after the suspense. So being mindful of what is surprise, what is suspense. You might have been surprised the first time you were watching Alien and, the crew went to the derelict ship. That same scene becomes suspense when you are sitting on the couch next to your friend who's never seen Alien. And you can enjoy it again. This is often why you might watch a comedy, and it can still be funny, but maybe you don't laugh out loud. But when you're sitting on a couch with a friend or family member who's never seen the comedy, you laugh alongside them like it's the first time because you're experiencing it in a different way from a different light, but it's still the same content. Always make the audience suffer as much as possible, right? If you keep everyone slightly on edge, you keep them in the fear of the unknown, and the unknown is fear, is where horror and terror can come from. A good horror movie makes a good suspense movie the second time around, says Valendar. Afterfoff says the same concept is emphasized in the 1980 remake of Night of the Living Dead. The horror is not the zombies, it's the group not fully working together and doing things that they think will help them but are in reality hurting them. Yes, yes. So if there are people like Alfred Hitchcock, like Vincent Price, I don't know, there might even be some very compelling Elvira quotes out there as well. I'm a typed director. If I made Cinderella, the audience would immediately be looking for a body in the coach. TV has brought murder back into the home where it belongs. Right? In today's parlance, I believe the youth would be saying, oof, big mood.
Sound a feasting horn.
So, what I'm going to do is get up and take a little bit of a break. Thank you very much, DM's Quill. I like that name. Speaking of storytelling and writing, DM's Quill, thank you so much. Let's go to the break screen for a couple minutes while I get up and refresh myself. After all, in the words of wisdom from Alfred Hitchcock, the length of a film should be directly related to the endurance of the human bladder. I will say this, people who enjoy horror are often very, very blunt about things, right? There's an understanding of human nature and psyche and such. A lot of horror people can be just absolutely brutally honest and blunt with you. And so, you know, especially like, oh, clutch the pearls. We had someone mention the human bladder. Well, I mean, look, this is also very practical. Because at the end of the day, say what you will, do what you will. If Michael Myers stabs you with a knife, it's not just dealing 1d4 plus strength damage. It's going to end you. So there's a practicality that a lot of horror aficionados tend to carry about themselves. What's more scary, the body in Cinderella's coach or learning that she knew about it all along and said nothing when writing it? The twist. All right, I'll be back soon, everyone.